Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very happy to see you all for tonight's webinar on OOSH transitions. And we are very happy to have both our P&C Association members here with us tonight. And we've opened up this webinar to non-members as well. So anyone that's joining us from an OOSH committee or just anyone from a public school who is interested in this issue, I'm really glad to have you here with us tonight. Thank you very much. I'll begin tonight's webinar by acknowledging country. In the spirit of reconciliation, the P&C Federation acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout New South Wales and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here tonight. And I'm joining you from Wallamedigal land here today, and I'm very proud to share this land with the amazing public schools that rest on this particular land. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Gemma Quinn and I am the CEO of the P&C Federation of New South Wales. We have all of our P&Cs represented in the OOSH space with over 50 OOSHs that are run by P&Cs, but we know that there are a number of people here tonight that come from a very different lived experience, being incorporated associations that run OOSHs, and I'm going to do your best to answer your questions tonight. For those people in OOSHs that are not experienced with the P&C Federation, we are the peak body for P&C associations in New South Wales. We provide support, advice, advocacy, training and general guidance to P&Cs and have done for over 100 years. We represent parents as the voice of parents and carers in New South Wales, particularly to the New South Wales Department of Education, but also represent New South Wales parents on a federal level as well. For those of you who are looking at a P&C association and have not been a member to date, I would encourage you to look at your P&C association in your school and the benefits that it offers your school community. P&C associations are focused on bringing everyone in the school community into close collaboration and indeed close cooperation. They run a multitude of services on public schools, and some of those services can and indeed will in future be out of school hours care services. And hopefully tonight I'll be able to answer some of your questions as to how that happens. I do want to call out though from the outset that we have a lot of people on tonight's webinar from a variety of different backgrounds, but also at different stages of the process, and we only have an hour. So while I do encourage Q&A, I am going to treat this as an overview. If needed, we will happily do more webinars on this topic and provide additional guidance to our P&Cs, but this is definitely an overview and I won't be able to answer some of the more nuanced and detailed legal questions that have come up through our pre-registration Q&A. So we'll see how we go. So many parents have been inquiring in New South Wales about how they operate an OOSH if they're currently an office bearer on a P&C association. And that's the topic of tonight's webinar. This isn't a webinar for our P&C associations, that 50 odd or so that currently run OOSHs. It's not about how to operationally manage an OOSH that is a quality service for kids. So if that's why you've joined us here tonight, we can do that separately. And I encourage you to reach out to the member services team who can answer some of those detailed questions. But this particular webinar is about transitioning an incorporated association that's been managed by parents on your public school to P&C management or control. It's a very complex process, and we're going to give you a bit of an overview. So OOSHs on public schools. The first thing to acknowledge is that this is a space that is regulated by the Department of Education in New South Wales, which obviously makes sense given that they have control and management and facilitation of public school sites. The community use of school facilities procedure is the one that looks at how services operate on public schools, and in particular for our context, how OOSHs are managed from a procurement process to ensure that there is transparency in terms of who is operating services and potentially making financial benefit from operating a service on a public school site. Only P&C associations under that policy are currently exempt from going through a commercial tender process when they want to operate on a school site. Previously, a few years ago, parent managed OOSHs were also afforded that exemption from tender, but that is no longer the case. Now, I do want to call out very early on that the Federation has not asked for this exemption. It was not the Federation's position that this policy, or sorry, rather procedural change should occur. But now that we're in this situation, we're going to do our absolute best to support both parties in managing the process, because we fundamentally believe in parental and in community involvement in the services operating on public schools. So, P&C associations have a role in providing services and in promoting recreation and welfare of students, and that comes from our objects that are set in our standardised constitution. Every P&C association in New South Wales has the same constitution and the same objects. They are set up to do the same things. In recognition of this, the Department of Education has allowed a privileged position for P&Cs as a major and fundamental stakeholder in public schools to be exempt from the tender process. And that's why we've seen this shift from previously parent managed parent managed incorporated associations operating OOSHs. Now it is now only going to be P&Cs that are exempt under the policy. Prior to this and currently, there were approximately 150 parent incorporated associations running OOSHs on public schools. That number has fallen just a little bit in the last few years since the policy changed. And there has been 50 approximately P&C associations providing OOSH. So this is a new space for a lot of P&Cs. We haven't traditionally been the major provider of out-of-school hours care in public education, but it's important to call out that parents could be members of their P&C association and could have previously been members of their incorporated association operating OOSH. So that shared knowledge, that shared experience historically for hundreds of years and for the last few decades operating out of school hours care is a shared one. And we can really lean from both sides, the P&C association side and the out of school hours incorporated association side, on each other to establish what is best practice in operating an OOSH and how we're going to go forward. And we'll talk a bit about how we can set up those methods for communication a little bit later in the piece. Everyone requires a license to operate on a public school site. The Department of Education, and more specifically the school infrastructure area of the department, manages that license process. It's interesting to call out, if you're not familiar with department processes, that you will have to have interactions with a variety of areas of government when you are becoming involved in the operation of an early childhood service. You will have your interactions with the school infrastructure area for the purpose of your license agreement, which is more like a rental agreement. But you will also have to have interactions with the Early Childhood Education and Care Directorate as the regulatory authority in New South Wales when it comes to managing your regulatory and legal obligations under the national laws for early childhood and education care services. You will also have to have interactions with the Commonwealth Government when we're looking at your approval and your right to administer childcare subsidy if you are going to be a provider of out of school hours care. Your options with regard to a license agreement. Currently, as it stands, if you are a parent managed incorporated association and you would like to continue operation after your license ends, you will need to go to commercial tender unless you move to the P&C model, in which case you will obviously no longer be this incorporated association entity, you will be a P&C entity. And we'll talk about that distinction in a little while. If you decide not to do that, if you decide not to go through with a bid in the commercial tender process, then obviously you will wind up, you will cease to operate, and a new provider that is selected through the tender process will take your place on your public school site. Otherwise, you can decide to be part of that tender process. And I do want to acknowledge that it is a highly competitive process. So far, we've had, since the policy change, 7 out of school hours care services that were previously parent managed go to tender, and none of those providers have been retained by parent run incorporated associations. So it's something to consider when you're weighing up what you're going to do in the future, and something also to talk to your P&C association about. From the P&C side, a P&C is, as you know, fundamentally at the service of their members. You have an obligation and, frankly, the privilege of serving your members if you are an office bearer of a P&C, and it's your duty to make sure you consult with your P&C members when you are deciding whether or not you are interested in even going down this road of potentially operating an OOSH. There are costs involved, there are a number of steps, and it is complex, but it is something that is achievable if it is what your members want. And I would encourage you to talk to your broader community to find out what is in the best interest of the school. As a P&C association, it's our duty to make sure that we are servicing the school and the needs that they have to support the children and families that attend that school. The timeframes. A lot of people have asked this. So at the moment, there have been, I've lost count, frankly, of how many deadlines for transition have been published since the policy change. As it stands, if you are actively investigating the transition of your existing incorporated associations, OOSH, to the P&C Association, and you can demonstrate that either by emailing your principal and your asset management or asset activations representative from the Department of Education, or you can provide some minutes of a P&C meeting to say that you're investigating this or taking active steps, then you will be afforded leniency at the end of your existing OOSH's license. So if your license is going to expire, say, in January 2025, I would encourage you now to contact your principal if you are going down this process and you haven't already let them know, and tell your principal that you are actively investigating the transition process or you're taking steps, and that you will need some additional time, perhaps a month-to-month rolling situation on your license, to ensure that your OOSH that exists now as an incorporated association is allowed to continue operating while you are trying to complete the process. Because as we know, this is a complex process, it is a time-consuming process, and it's not something that happens overnight. So why is it so complex? Probably the first thing to look at is the different models that we're looking at and the difference between them for a P&C association and an incorporated OOSH. So for an incorporated association under the Associations Incorporations Act 2009, we have a constitution that is set by the entity itself. So your OOSH could have a completely different, and is likely to have a completely different constitution, its governing document, to the OOSH on the public school down the road if they are also run by an incorporated association. You have a management committee, and each of those office bearers on the management committee, your president, secretary, treasurer, and vice president, if you have one, are considered what we call persons with management or control. Now, that term comes from the national law that covers early childhood and education care services, so that includes OOSHs, and it is something that requires a registration process. Then underneath that, you will have your staff, and you will delegate, as a person with management or control, certain duties to your staff to make sure that all of the things that are required to be done under the national law and regulations are being done without you as a volunteer having to execute them yourself. Under the P&C Association model, we have what's called a prescribed constitution, which is very different to our, OOSH colleagues in the incorporated association space. For P&C associations, our constitution is set by the Minister for Education directly. So we can say with absolute certainty that any P&C association that is incorporated under the P&C Associations Incorporation Act from 1976 is going to have the exact same set of governing terms, being its constitution, as any other, regardless of what school they're operating from. And that cannot come with any local changes. Underneath that, you have your P&C executive, but the P&C executive does not have the right to make decisions in the same way that a management committee operating in an incorporated OOSH does. The P&C executive is there to execute the operations regarding behind the decisions made by the members of the P&C. So, for example, if the executive of your P&C association wanted to take on your existing OOSH service, they could not decide that themselves. They would need to take that decision back to the members, and the members would need to vote at a regular meeting of the P&C, and then the executive would be able to do the legwork behind making the transition happen, provided that was within the terms of what they'd been entitled to do by vote of members of the P&C Association. Underneath that, P&C associations often have subcommittees, and that's because P&C associations provide so many different services and do so many different things in their public school. So subcommittees could be, I've got there the example band, but it could also be canteen subcommittee, we've got uniform shops, we've got fundraising, we've got events, all of these different things that may or may not have staff attached that P&C associations do. For OOSHs, the OOSHs need to potentially have some subcommittee structure attached to support the executive to understand the sheer number of things that any OOSH has to do, because it is a very complex and highly regulated area. So while you're not required to have a subcommittee, it is something that our existing P&Cs that do run OOSHs have found very helpful, because you can draw on expertise from a particular set of volunteer parents or citizens that are in tune with what's going on in your OOSH and have a vested interest in making sure they make the right recommendations and provide you, as an office bearer of the P&C, sitting on the P&C executive, everything you need to know. Now, for parents who have come from a management committee in an existing OOSH Incorporated association, then it might be of interest to you to talk to your P&C about whether or not you would be interested in sitting on a OOSH subcommittee. You won't have decision-making power over what happens in the OOSH, but you will be able to provide guidance, you'll be able to provide support to your office bearers and to indeed your staff, to make sure that the operations of the OOSH are as consistent as the P&C is as happy for them to be, with the model that you've previously moved from. Now, I'm just going to take a moment, if you don't mind, because the team are letting me know that there are a huge number of questions coming through. So have a little look at this slide for 1 second while I just read through some of these questions. Wow, okay. The team weren't wrong. There are a lot of questions. Okay, so we've got some pretty detailed questions here. We've got some that are about the process, some legal questions. We do have one person that has asked who those OOSHs that were put out to tender were, and I would be happy to pull that up, because that is probably the only part of content that we haven't already covered. If you just give me 1 second to pull up that list. For anyone of interest, those OOSHs were OOSHs operated on Sutherland Public School, Wagga Wagga Public School, Camberwara Public School, Galston Public School, Katara South and Bel Air, and Lucas Heights Community School. So for interest in the same order. The providers that won those tenders were Camp Australia, Camp Australia, Camp Australia, Extend Before and After School Care, Jigsaw, Team Kids, and Task. And all of that information is publicly available for anyone interested. The tenders that go up and the wishes that have gone out to tender is available on the e-tendering website, which is a New South Wales government website that you're obviously welcome to check. And the providers, including any transition information of providers, is available on the ASEQA website. Who have we got here? Okay, so who holds the profits? We will come back to that question when we get into the process just a little bit further. If the OOSH is tendered commercially, can a P&C apply to take over the management once the license is due for renewal? So no. Ooh, look, this is a complex area. So it isn't as simple as saying that when a license has ended, the P&C can decide to take over the existing provider, because what will happen is we no longer have this ability to transfer. What would need to happen is, picture it as you've got this existing OOSH that is an incorporated association. It decides not to go through the tender process, or it does not win the tender process. That then needs to close down. It ceases to exist. You then have someone else through the tender process that is successful, that decides that comes in, sets up an OOSH, and continues operation for the duration of its license. At the time of tender, yes, there is a situation where a P&C could say, we now have an appetite to operate an OOSH. We are the preferred provider type, and we would like to start operation of an OOSH. But what would happen in that case is you would be starting from scratch. You would need to have your approvals sorted. You would need to be sourcing staff in advance of the date that you would need to open. You wouldn't be moving staff across. You wouldn't be moving across the existing policies, procedures, the existing enrolment information. You would be completely starting from here. And for a P&C to start an OOSH and establish an OOSH for the first time is an incredibly complex process. I mean, if we think this process is hard, that one is almost out of reach. It is very difficult. I'm certainly not saying that it can't be done, but it would not be an enjoyable process from a volunteer perspective, in my personal opinion, but it is possible. Delegations will get into OOSH is running subcommittees. P&C's running OOSH subcommittees. We'll talk a little bit about subcommittees, how they work, what that means under the delegated authority and the national law and regs a little bit later, so I will come back to that. And how long do licenses last for? A license is essentially 5 years. So every time your license ends, and you will need to go through the commercial tender process again in order to continue operation beyond the end of that license, if that's what you choose to do. That's not the case for a P&C association. Any P&C association will have a license and then will be afforded a new license without going to tender at the end of that license. The reason for that is not to say that you can't continue operation, but rather if any new terms have been included in the license, and they are standardized licenses across the state for the most part, then it means that you've just got yours updated and it becomes a rolling situation. So, persons with management or control. Under the national law, the Children Education and Care Services National Law 2010, it is very clearly defined who is going to be, under any particular entity type, the persons with management or control of a childcare service. For a P&C association, it's very plainly each member of the executive committee. That can pose some challenges when you've got a very large executive committee, because as we know, under a normal incorporated association, we have a traditional executive. We have a president, potentially a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer. Four people that must be registered as persons with management or control. Under a P&C association, you may have a much larger executive. You might decide to have, we already have a president, two vice presidents, a secretary, and a treasurer, but you might also decide to appoint additional people to your executive. You might decide to invite the OOSH subcommittee convener to hold a position on the executive, or any other convener, for example, as a member of the executive. And under the definition in the law, it is plain, you must register then those people as persons with management or control. Now, this isn't an insurmountable challenge for us. There are things we can do to alleviate any pressure on those volunteers to becoming a person with management or control. We can rethink the structure perhaps of your P&C to still give those people buy-in at executive meetings without having to be a formalized member of the executive. All things that we can talk about and provide guidance on as the P&C Federation. But as it stands, this is the definition, and this is what you would need to do when you are registering your persons with management or control. Now, I should probably take a step back for those people that aren't familiar with the PMC model. So every out of school hours care service will have people who are in charge of the management or control of your childcare service as defined under the law. They are people that have very specific duties under the law and regulations, and it makes sense as a model to have some group of people that are in charge of the way the legal entity does its business, conducts its business, that are going to be responsible for anything that happens in the childcare side of its operations. In the law, you've got to have all of the executive members registered. We've seen a lot of examples where people are trying to start the transition process and they have said, well, can't the president just be the person with management or control? Or couldn't a staff member who in reality is delegated a lot of the operational functions of the out of school hours care service, couldn't they be your person with management or control? And the reason I put the definition very clearly here is that no, they cannot. It brings us to this idea of liability. If then you have persons with management or control registered with the regulatory authority who are named and very clearly registered as to who they are, what's their personal liability? Now, for our P&C Association members and office bearers that are here tonight, this is probably something you're already going to be familiar with, the concept of limited liability, because it is exactly that same concept that goes to all of your operations as a P&C association. Similarly, the same concept applies for those people here tonight that are coming from management committees of a out of school hours care service. Limited liability is it's a legal concept, and I'm not here to give legal advice, and I certainly don't want to anyone to be labouring under the understanding that this is legal advice, because it most certainly is not. But just as a concept, the idea is that if, as an office bearer, you have taken steps to make sure you have oversight of what is happening in your operations, if you are making sure that anything you've delegated to a staff member has a process around it, and you get regular reporting on what is happening, any particular risks, any particular incidents, then you are not, as an individual, going to be, and again, not legal advice, but you're likely not to be liable for what has happened. We're talking about situations where something quite egregious happens, where you might be personally liable as an individual. We're talking about you just turning a complete blind eye to what's happening, pretending that All of the risks that you might know are happening out in the ether don't exist. You might be told by your staff member. Please be aware that there is a live wire running through the out of school hours care service, and I really need you to give me the permission to get an electrician in and fix that. And you just go, nah, don't want to hear it, don't want to touch it. Leave the live wire there. Well, obviously, in that case, it makes common sense that you should be personally liable for any injury that happens to a child. It is not something that is going to be fundamentally different operating an out of school hours care service than any of your other operations as a P&C. What I would say is that you need to be very clear on your delegations, and this is where we can provide guidance as the Federation, because this is something that's going to be similar for every P&C association that is going to be operating an OOSH. You have the same named duties as a person with management or control as any other person with management or control from a P&C association, and you need to have the same structures in order to make sure that you're delegating those to paid staff so you don't have to execute them operationally as an office bearer, but at the same time that you're satisfied that they're happening and you're getting reporting that makes you confident that those duties are being discharged. So for everyone, and there were a lot of questions, that is concerned about liability, that's really it in a nutshell, but I'm happy to answer probably won't be me. The member services team is very happy to answer your specific questions, and you're welcome to call us or to email us to get that further guidance. Or I should have mentioned probably at the outset that we also have our member portal available to everyone who is on a P&C association, where you can also get some of that additional guidance, our fact sheets, and even our FAQs that are available to you. I'm going to take this moment again to pause because we did have some more questions that are coming through. So, what's the point of a subcommittee if the executive is taking liability? The point of a subcommittee is to provide the legwork, to do all of the operational requirements that you wouldn't have your staff doing, but also that the executive might not have the physical time to execute or the expertise to execute as an office bearer of the P&C. And I will use my own school's P&C as an example. So at our school's P&C, we have 5 subcommittees. We operate a dance program, a band program, canteen, a uniform shop, and events. And if the office bearers needed to be in each of those areas, dealing with each of those staff on a day-to-day basis, it wouldn't be possible. It would be a full-time job. The idea of having a subcommittee is to make sure that someone is there with that nuanced understanding. So, for example, a convener of a subcommittee might go in and have discussions with the staff about employment matters. They might go in and if there is the call to say, we've got an urgent issue and we need to talk through it with someone, it might be the person who is their point of contact on the subcommittee to go in and do that. And usually it's going to be someone that attends the OOSH and has some sort of understanding of what the OOSH model is, because you might find that those people who decide to run for office bearer positions on your P&C aren't necessarily going to come from your OOSH community and therefore won't have that level of understanding. So the subcommittee can alleviate the pressure on the executive, but what's important is then to make sure that the subcommittee reports anything that is material back to the executive. So in the same model as any other subcommittee, if at every P&C meeting, the subcommittee convener should be tabling a report, letting everyone know what's happened in the reporting period in that particular area. So where do we start on the process? We've had a lot of process questions. How, as a P&C, do you go about transitioning? And what do you do as a P&C? And what, as an OOSH and an incorporated OOSH, do you need to know? We're going to give you a little bit of an overview. For the P&C, I don't want this to be deceivingly simple. Please don't all flood me with questions at once. It is complicated, and there are sub steps under each of these. But generally, you need to meet as a P&C association to discuss whether or not you are interested in going through this process and investigating whether or not you want to take on your OOSH. We've talked a lot as the P&C Federation about the due diligence process. Now, the due diligence process is not meant to be this very corporate model of due diligence that comes with a very high price tag. It's something that you could pay an external provider for if you wanted to, but I have worked with a lot of P&Cs that are going through this process who have decided to take it on themselves and produced an understanding for their members of everything that those members need to know through the due diligence process without hiring external. And I think that given that there are other steps in the process that do require external paid advice, it might not be the place that you decide to spend your money, but it is an option if you'd want to. I'm going to talk through what goes through in a due diligence process and what you need to look for on the next slide. But for now, after the due diligence process is complete, which is meant to give you an idea of whether or not, or rather give your members an idea of whether or not they are interested in taking on the OOSH, you will need to table that report back to members. You'll need to talk to your members at a P&C meeting, make a recommendation either way, either yes, we take on the OOSH or no, we don't, and make a decision. And you cannot, as an office bearer or as an executive as a whole, start commencing that process until you have that authority given to you by your P&C Association members. If you decide to do that, then you can start commencing the transfer process. Now, the transfer itself will need to occur from the OOSH, but before the transfer process, you are going to have a number of steps that you need to complete. And that's what I mean when I say there are sub-steps: to seek your provider approval, to have the approval and the authority to administer childcare subsidy, and also to have your structures in place to make sure on the day that your service transfer is approved, that you are then ready to start operating your out of school hours care service as a P&C association. In terms of due diligence, the idea of due diligence is all about assessing risk. That doesn't mean mitigating all risk. It doesn't mean deciding this is a completely neutral undertaking and we are entirely comfortable, therefore, in taking it on. Instead, it means understanding as an office bearer, as the P&C Association, what it is that you're taking on, and then deciding whether or not you are comfortable with taking it on. So identifying potential conflicts at the outset is pretty critical because there are so many different, very closely held ideals and indeed experiences in your P&C Association. And that's like any other decision. So identify conflicts up front and decide how you're going to deal with them. We get asked a lot whether that means that someone who uses the OOSH is not allowed to be involved in the vote to take on the OOSH, or whether someone who has previously held a position on the Incorporated Association Management Committee has the same right to, as a P&C member, then be involved in the discussion or perhaps even to vote on the decision. That's not a decision for me to say, no, that conflict is unacceptable. You cannot allow them to vote. I have a personal opinion and a personal appetite for conflict, but that's something for you to decide whether or not you're happy with. I think on the whole, on balance, I think it would be appropriate to just record that potential conflict on the register and still allow those people to be engaged in the discussion because they hold a particular experience that might be valuable, and perhaps also to vote. For me, I would allow it, but it really is up to you. And if you're concerned about conflict, you're very welcome to get in touch with our member services team who can talk through your particular situation and give more nuanced guidance for your particular case. Once you've identified conflicts and you've decided how you're going to manage them, then you can assess the current OOSH provider's financial situation and also any other contracts and most perhaps the most complex part of that is reviewing employment contracts. So I would suggest perhaps looking at the last 3 years of operation, acknowledging as well that we have had COVID. So there is going to be some nuance there that you need to have a look at and consider as part of your overall picture that you're painting. I've known wishes that have gone for 5 to 6 years. Again, this is something that you will decide based on the size of your WUSH, the particular community that you're servicing, and what your appetite for due diligence is. We can provide that guidance for anyone who's had the luxury of speaking to the wonderful Robert and his both CEO and accounting experience on the phone. You can always have a chat to our member services team and they'll provide you again that guidance. You can then decide whether or not you're interested in looking at the employment contracts with legal advice at this stage. For me, during the due diligence process, it would depend on the number of staff and whether or not, as a person conducting the due diligence, I identified any red flags as to whether I would get legal advice at that stage. But that's also something you might want to talk about, and we're happy to provide guidance. You can then look at the operational risks, assessing the know-how in your team, the know-how of parents in operating an OOSH, and that might mean including your existing parents that operate as persons with management or control, and whether or not they would be interested in moving over to a P&C model. I would encourage you also to talk to those parents on management committees about whether or not they felt satisfied that they were discharging their duties, because remembering as well that limited liability concept applied to them. They were doing the same thing. So talk to them about how they interacted with staff, how the reporting worked at their committee meetings, whether or not, what the time commitment was in terms of particular risks being identified to them and them having to navigate them. It's going to be different in every OOSH. Every OOSH is going to have different complexities. I know I am the president of my children's OOSH at their public school, and I probably I think I would spend less than an hour talking to staff every week, and that's quite a large OOSH. So you're going to need to really get a sense, if you're going to take this on, about how the processes of reporting work and how much time is involved, which will also give you a sense of how much risk is attached. Are there things that you don't know that are going to get reported up to you? Or are you satisfied that it's being adequately managed by the staff team that you're delegating your duties to? Finally, having a look at the subcommittee model, whether that's something interesting to you, potentially having a look at our template bylaws that are available to members on the P&C member portal, and deciding whether or not that's the way you would like to go in terms of your governance model, or if you're satisfied having the OOSH operate directly under the executive and report directly into your executive. In terms of process, someone has asked, do P&C executives, and in that case, persons with management or control, need to sit an exam before being granted provider approval? The answer is yes. It is an open book exam. It is something that we are currently working with the department on. We do meet with them with regards to the process. We are trying to alleviate some of that. I can't speak to any changes in the future, but certainly I'm aware of the burden that poses for volunteer parents in terms of sitting an exam, even though it is an open book exam, and you can, in particular, have the national laws and regulations in front of you. It is still a very big ask, particularly for working parents, to take time out of their working day and or their day, doing whatever it is they need to do, and sit an exam. So yes, but something that I'm certainly aware of, and the team is aware of, and we can provide guidance on that hopefully in the future. How many parent-run services have successfully transitioned? That is a look, it's a hard question. We're aware of one that has completed the transition process. In terms of the steps that they undertook, I cannot speak to those steps or whether or not they would follow the guidance that I would provide. It's not a case that we manage directly. There is only the one that has successfully completed transfer of service. Whether or not they have then from the OOSH side of things wound up that OOSH, which does obviously need to occur following the transfer, well, as part of the transfer of assets to the P&C Association. I don't know where they're up to in that process, but the specific transfer of service approval has been completed. So one in New South Wales that's completed that. Could you use your audited accounts for the due diligence process? Absolutely. Absolutely, you could. Providing your audited accounts would be my absolute first stop in providing information to the P&C as part of the due diligence process. Now, the P&C is obviously entitled to ask for more information than that. They might ask for your balance sheets, your P&Ls. They might ask to sit down potentially with your treasurer or maybe even if your accountant, if you have one. They would probably also ask to see your standard employment contract, potentially talk through any outstanding employment liabilities that they might become aware of by looking at your financials. They can ask for more, and in many cases they will ask for more, but your audited accounts would be absolutely an appropriate first step. And depending on the size of your operation, maybe the substantial part of what a P&C needs to understand your financial situation as an OOSH. Starting an OOSH from scratch is very difficult. Someone's asked, Rachel's asked. Hi, Rachel. Your school's only 3 years old. Your principal's very keen. Rachel, I would absolutely love to provide more guidance on that for you. It is doable. It is doable. Certainly transitioning a OOSH over is easier. I misspoke. I shouldn't have oversold the challenges that are involved in the process. If you flick me an email for anyone who is interested, the mail at p&c.org.au email address is the best one to reach our member services team on. They can escalate something to me if need be, and we would be more than happy to walk you through any detailed questions or any steps in the process. Given the large number of volunteers required to manage the variety of P&C activities, canteen band, etc., does the Federation believe there's capacity for the majority of P&Cs to take on the management of a large OOSH? Michelle, great question. My personal belief is yes. I have lived experience, and my personal belief is yes, that it is something that's very much within the reach of P&Cs. I know that I come from a privileged position, being in a public school that does have a reasonable appetite for volunteering, and that's not going to be everyone's experience. Having been on our rural and regional roadshows in the last 12 months and visited some of our remote schools and talked to those P&Cs, I know that there are P&Cs that operate on the volunteer, smell of an oily rag, and maybe that's going to be a very different scenario to work through about what it looks like. But for my personal experience, I think it's manageable. I think that the majority of P&Cs, thinking about the number of volunteers that they report to us that they have in their respective sizes, and also having it looked at the 150 P&Cs that potentially could transition, the data would suggest to me that yes, it is manageable and it is doable. Can a subcommittee member hold the same position in the P&C executive? So a subcommittee member can absolutely hold a position on the P&C executive, Hayley, definitely. Now, you might then have to wear a couple of different hats and execute a couple of different duties depending on the scenario you are in, but you can be on both. And that's something that we do. Again, when you've got a limited pool of volunteers, it's something that we do see a lot. There is a lot of double up in our particularly active volunteers in P&C associations. Bank accounts. Thank you to the person that asked the question about bank accounts. And I'm sorry for the pace. I'm very conscious of time and the number of questions that we've still got open. Does our treasurer have to approve all payments? No. So what we need to do in a P&C model is we need to make sure that you have, for starters, permission from your members, because remembering the executive only has that ability to operationally execute what the members have already decided. So um, in the P&C model, the treasurer and the executive would not have any direct decision making over the payments that are made. What we advise people do is they set up a budget. If you can, at a regular interval, usually once per year, provide a budget. And for your OOSHs, in the Incorporated Associations, the OOSHs are usually already providing an annual budget to their management committee, and I would advise that that's probably going to be a fairly good model to adopt what they're already doing. And then if your members then approve that budget, they are satisfied, there's a vote of members at a meeting to say the executive are delegated that right, that ability to execute the budget operationally, then they are allowed to do so. The executive can then delegate that role to, say, a staff member. What you want to do, though, is have some processes in place from a governance perspective. So perhaps having a delegated authority policy, perhaps having a policy on the use of a debit card. These are things that we have templates for in the member portal that are going to mean that the staff members can make payments as and when they need to without having to escalate every single minute financial decision back up to the executive. So big payments, the executive are the only people that can be signatories on the bank account. You cannot have signatories on that bank account that are from your subcommittee unless they are also a person that is an office bearer of your P&C Association. I should make that clear. It must be an office bearer of the P&C. We recommend, and most banks will require, that you have 2 signatories, and any regular payments should be being authorized, usually wages, fortnightly is the standard model, but you can decide to do that how you will. Be authorized by 2 members of your office bearers of your P&C. What you can do, though, is then also set up a debit card. So you could say, we're happy under our delegations policy for maybe $2,000, just as an example, to be put as cash on the debit card available to our staff at any given time to make payments within the confines of the budget that we've set, as long as that's reported back and it's all accounted for. And those 2 or 2 signatories will then be required to transfer any top-up cash to that debit card. But every day, as needed, your staff member will be able to go down and buy apples from the local grocer to make sure there's some fresh fruit at afternoon tea or that sort of thing. So there are things that you can do. We've got the templates available because this is a very common model across the state, and we're more than happy to provide support there. Could you not delegate operational responsibilities such as recruitment to a subcommittee? Great question. You can delegate all of that work that needs to be done to a subcommittee, provided that the decision is coming back by way of recommendation and report to the executive. So, for example, if the recruitment process is one that's going to require you should have, presumably, depending on what you decide to do, a staff member with the requisite experience as part of the recruitment process. And my preferred model would be to have a member of the executive, but you could potentially have, say, your convener of your subcommittee sitting on a recruitment panel, as long as the recommendations that they make, I would be sending through a paper if I was the subcommittee convener in that situation that says, this is the recommendation. Here is all of the information that we gathered as part of the process. So I would have any notes that the panel took as part of the interview process. I would have the CV, the cover letter, anything that you gathered, and I would provide that to the executive for final sign off. And it should be the members of the executive that sign the employment contract. Can the delegation of the persons with management or control be to the subcommittee? And the quick answer to that portion of the question, David, is no. The persons with management or control are defined in the legislation, and so they must be the executive and all of the executive of the P&C Association. Can you have the subcommittee be the same people that were on the management committee? Yes, you absolutely can. And in a lot of cases, that's what people are choosing to do because that experience is there. I'm going to try and get through a few more slides. I know we've only got 5 minutes, but I think it's really important to look at the process from the Incorporated Association perspective. So in terms of process, you need to let all of your members know what is going on. And if you are going to decide to wind up, to cease to exist because you are transferring operation of your OOSH to the P&C, then you'll need to call, usually under your constitution, a special general meeting to do so, but you'll need to check your constitution. The P&C due diligence process, you will go through that. You will potentially want to establish a confidentiality agreement. It is up to you. It can just be a very simple 1-page. You might, as part of the due diligence, find information that regards to particular families or particular children, and we require that you keep that confidential. That just protects you as an office bearer of your OOSH. It's most relevant for debtors. So if you've got families that owe money and you're doing that financial portion of the due diligence, you might uncover some names, and we just want to make sure that everyone is protected throughout this process, but it can be very simple. As the OOSH, you'll provide the documents that the P&C requires, and that communication is really vital to making sure the members have everything they need to make the decision as to whether or not they want to take on the OOSH, and potentially work with external professionals to go through any additional legal or financial work that is required as part of the process. So when I say working with externals, there is going to likely be at some point a need to get some advice with regards to the employment contracts in particular. It might also be other contracts that your OOSH has. And see that we haven't had people drop off, so people are obviously still interested. We've got 3 minutes. I'm happy to go a little bit over time. You're welcome to stay on if you would like to. So I just want to make sure that we get through this process part. So the employment contracts in particular, you might want to have a lawyer look over them just to identify whether or not they are if there are any major red flags that you need to be aware of as a P&C association. And indeed for the Incorporated Association, there's going to need to be a decision whether or not the employment contracts are going to be transferred over to the P&C Association with everything as it stands currently, or whether you're going to need to pay out your staff and those staff will then need to be rehired under the P&C. Both of those are reasonable options. When a P&C is making that decision, some of the things they might look at are what the liabilities are, whether they are satisfied with the type of contracts that exist, indeed whether or not they want to go through their own recruitment processes or whether they're happy with the existing staff, but they have that right to make that decision. And that employment piece is a completely different discussion to the transfer of assets, and it also is a different discussion to the transfer of service approval. We're dealing with so many different layered processes here. So we've got, for the national laws and regulations operating the childcare service, we've got the provider approval that needs to happen for a P&C association, and when we transfer the service across. And that's just the right to operate this service, and then the serviceability, and then the service itself. In addition to that, if you want to transfer over the staff that are existing, you'll need to make sure that there is some sort of documentation, we call it novating the contract, to make sure that the party to the contract is no longer the Incorporated Association and the employee. The new party is the P&C Association and the employee. Then everything can stay the same. Their liabilities remain the same. So if they've accrued any leave, etc., and you transfer it across and the staff remain in the same position, just with a new employer, that's an option. If the P&C decides not to do that, you as an incorporated association are going to then need to end the employment contracts. You are going to need to then pay out your staff. And that, depending on your situation, is usually done through the liquidation process, but you might also want to get some additional legal advice if your liquidator recommends it. Liquidation is the wind-up process, and your liquidator is going to be able to provide you all of the support that's required to go through that. The reason that you need to liquidate as an incorporated association, or that you need to wind up rather, is because for the vast majority, and in fact, I've never seen one that bucks the trend, the incorporated associations that run out of school hours care services tend to have very limited objects. They, under their constitutions, are set up to run an OOSH on a public school. For any incorporated association, if you no longer fulfill your objects, which of course you wouldn't be fulfilling your objects if you no longer operate an OOSH, then you have no choice but to wind up. In addition to that, if you are transferring the service, it makes very reasonable sense that you are going to transfer the assets, all of your cash, all of your resources that you have to your P&C Association so that they can continue operations without there being any gap in the service that's provided to the families at your school. We get a lot of questions from both sides of the fence about what happens with the assets, whether or not the out of school hours care service can retain the incorporated association, and the people who sat on the management committee can retain any control over the assets when they're transferred across. And I suppose my general guidance would be that we're all here with the same objective, which is to provide the best possible experience for our parents and children in public schools. And we have to respect, in the same way that when there is changeover at an AGM of an incorporated association or a P&C association, that there might also be changeover in the way the parents involved or the parents that run for a particular position want to fulfill that objective. And the same goes moving your assets from your OOSH to your P&C association. By providing information to the P&C association about how your OOSH needs to operate, how much working capital they need, why you might have particular reserves that you might have earmarked for projects, etc. Before you transfer the assets, you are future-proofing the decision-making process to make sure that there is complete transparency, and trying to give as much guidance as possible to the P&C, who are now going to be the people who are in control of doing what you need to do to operate your out of school hours care service. So once all of this is done, you've got your liquidator, you've appointed your lawyer, you've sorted out what you're going to do with your employment contracts, you also go through the transfer of service process and the wind-up process. For anyone that's been screenshotting the slides, I know that people like to look at things in different ways, so there is a different snapshot of the same information there available to you as well, but I won't walk through it a second time. So what comes next? It's a complex process. I think that much has been clear. It is possible. You can obviously seek support from the P&C Federation for all of those P&Cs that are here tonight and who would like additional guidance. And we can also support you to either source professional advice if you want to, or if you need to, or even help you assess the level of compliance that's required, or the level of risk associated with making that decision, particularly when there is hesitancy around spending parent money on advice to, the P&C Association. We know that the use of parent money is always at the front of everyone's mind, and if you can spend it back into your community rather than on advice, we will do everything within our power to support you to do that. So please make sure if you have any concerns to get in touch with us. We also have guidance on the way subcommittees work, for example, on your structure, on the templates that are available for your rules and your subcommittee rules. All of this is available on the member portal, and I would encourage you to have a look. And if there's anything there that you can't find, please get in touch with member services. Communication is critical, so make sure you do maintain your communication, not just with the P&C to OOSH relationship, but also the P&C to OOSH to staff relationship, and finally to the principal. Your principal is going to be the person that is going to be able to facilitate anything that needs to occur with the Department of Education in terms of transition, not in terms of the regulatory childcare side of transition, but certainly in terms of the license agreement side. So make sure you let them know what's happening and keep them abreast of the situation as it unfolds. I have well and truly gone over time now, guys, so I am going to let everyone go. Thank you so much for everyone that submitted questions. I'm sorry to those who we didn't get to tonight. The member services team will endeavour to answer all of your questions and put those on an FAQ along with some of the questions we got in advance of tonight's webinar up on the member portal. We'll also have a recording of tonight's webinar available on the member portal as well. And for any detailed questions, please make sure you get in touch with us. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found tonight useful, and I wish you the best of luck in everything that you are doing to make public education a wonderful space for our kids and families. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.